Hey, Anchor Church, we are so glad to have you back this morning. I wanted to let you know that we are getting into place plans for a student summer camp that's going to be right here where we record at Anchor South. The dates are going to be June 28th through July 1st, so please mark those on your calendars. If you have a student at home, we would love to have them come and join us. As for right now, let's prepare our hearts and watch this video before Justin comes up to give his sermon.
South. It's great to be with you online today. Last week we celebrated Mother's Day and we took a little break from our Ecclesiastes series, but we're going to jump back into it. But before we do, I just want to celebrate the day before Mother's Day. Anchor South got a little bigger. We added a new little baby to our church family. We Pearsons had our third son, Miles. He was born early in the morning last Saturday. And so you can rejoice with us as we celebrate God giving us this little guy. And then I just want to say thank you to all of you who have reached out to us, congratulated us, brought us a meal, sent us a gift card. It has been such a blessing. We are so thankful to have you as our church family. What a blessing that you have been to us. Well, I want to talk today from Ecclesiastes 6, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 24. We've got a big chunk, and Solomon, he's gonna talk about a better way of living. We saw God's promise to his people in that video we just watched from Jeremiah 29, that he has plans of blessing. Well, you know what? He made that promise to them when they were in captivity, in exile. He made a promise of a blessing and a better way to his people when they would seek his face. And that's what we're gonna talk about today, that God has a better way for us to live. Solomon, he's been putting all his wisdom and wealth to the test to see if it's going to last and it's going to fulfill, and pretty much everything that he's come up with has left him lacking. And so how do we live this life? You know, because we all want to live that best life, right? We want to all make the right decision so that we get the most benefit out of everything. It takes me back to when I was younger and I was thinking of all the big questions. Where am I going to go to college? Well, I went where I could afford, and so that was kind of decided for me. Who am I going to marry? Am I going to get married? Well, God blessed me with a wonderful wife. Y'all should all come meet her. She's great. What is my career going to be? Well, bouncing around, God gave me a calling to be a pastor and a church planter. But those are the kind of big questions and big thoughts that we get so anxious and so worried about as we're going on in life, that we want to make the right decision. We think if we make the wrong one, we're gonna screw everything up. But what we're going to see here is that God offers us a better way. A way that doesn't lead to anxiety, because it's not all on us. But a better way, that knowing that God is in control, that He's good, and when we seek Him and follow Him, that He is working everything for our good. So look with me. We've got a lot to go through, so look with me at Ecclesiastes chapter 6. We're going to start in verses 10 through 12. We're going to see a picture of God's control. He says in Ecclesiastes 6:10, "Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity. And what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him?" So Solomon, he's finishing this big section where he talked about how wealth will not fulfill, that the things that we pursue will not fulfill. And in verse 10, he says, whatever has come has already been named. And we talked about it last week, that idea of naming, it reflects the character of something. Like when Hagar saw who God was, what He was, she named Him. "You are the God who sees me, the God who looks after me." She saw His character and named Him and reflected that. And we saw it with God changing Abraham's name to Abraham and reflecting that he would be a father of a multitude of nations. Or God reflecting His character in the name of Ishmael, the Lord who hears. Well, what this is saying is that whatever has come to be has already been named. It's a reflection of God's great control over the things that have been, the things that are happening, and the things that will come. Whatever has been, whatever will be, has already been named. It's already been given a character. It's under God's sovereign control. And we, as humans, we can't fight against that. He says, "And it is known what man is, that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he." That one stronger than he is God. What God has set in motion, we cannot change. We can't mess it up with the wrong decision. Now, our sin is not what God calls us to, but even that can't mess up the plans that God has. But what is He saying here? You can't dispute with one stronger than He. When we see things that we don't like, we want to call out, we want to cry out. And God doesn't mind questions when we seek Him in faith, but when we think we know better than God and we tell God, then we need to take a step back. We need to be like Job. We've talked about him as we've gone through this series a little bit. Job, he suffered. He truly did, but then he sought an answer from God. He cried out to God. He called God out. And God answered him, not exactly what he wanted to hear, but God gave him the perspective that God is the one that is stronger than he. And it gave him the perception that he, as a man who is not God, needs to be careful how we try to argue with God, who is God, who has named all things. And so Job cries out to God. God gives him his answer. Basically says, where were you when I created everything? Can you control the stars in the sky and any of that? And Job, he's floored, he's humbled, and he answers God. He says, I know that you can do all things in Job 42:2. He says, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Just like Solomon says, man cannot dispute with one stronger than he. Nothing can stop God's plans. He can do all things. It says in verse 3 of Job 42, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? And then here he humbles himself and says, therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. He recognizes God's control. The fact that he, in his words, he was being vain, as Solomon would say. And we see it in verse 11 where he says, the more words, the more vanity. And what advantage is it to man? You can try to dispute God. You can try to change what he's done. You can try to fight him. But Solomon says it's vanity. It's a foolish pursuit. It's not going to end up how you want it to. Because God is in control. All things flow through his sovereign hand. And you may go to the thought that, okay, then we're just all robots. But no, he's given us the opportunity to make meaningful choices every day. We can choose to follow him. We can choose not to. God has control of everything to the point that the decisions that he allows us to make don't mess up anything that he's planned. He's working it all towards his end that he is bringing for the world and for the good of those who love him, Romans says. And so then it goes on. Job said it. I have uttered things that I don't understand, things too wonderful for me. In verse 12, it reflects this. It's God's control, it's God's wisdom, and it says, for who knows what is good for man while he lives the few vain days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? We don't know all things. God does. And in God's control and in his goodness, we can trust that he knows. Even when situations are hard, even when things are difficult. And we can say, like Job, you can do all things, God. Nothing that you do can be stopped or thwarted. And we can trust. We can trust that this God who is in control, the God who knows what is good. Because the answer to the question in verse 12 is God knows what is good for man to do. And God knows what will come after us as well. And we can trust that. And we're going to go on. Solomon moves on to chapter 7. And in typical Solomon way, he's going to give us some proverbs that tell us this better way to live. This better way that sees God's control, that trusts that he's good, and that follows him. And so starting in chapter 7, verses 1 through 13, we're going to see this better way. And he breaks it up into little sections. And so I'm going to go through the sections and we'll talk about it. But first, we see the better way. And it seems a little strange. But look at Ecclesiastes 7, 1 through 4 with me. First, he starts out in 7:1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go into the house of mourning than to go into the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Well, Solomon starts out, a good name is better than precious ointment in verse 1. He says, it's better to be thought of well. It's better to have good character than great wealth. So precious ointment in that time would have been very expensive, very costly to have. And in a time where there was no deodorant and everybody walked where they went, walked through streets filled with probably animal waste and all of that, it was probably of value to be able to smell nice. And so good, precious ointment would make you smell better, but it would be costly. It wasn't easy to get. It wasn't easy to make. But what Solomon says is it's better to have good character and a good name, to be well thought of, than to have lots of wealth. It's better to be stinky with a good name than to have a stinky character and a stinky name. But then he goes on in verse 1 and he says, the day of death is better than the day of birth. Now we're going to see throughout this whole section, he says that these things are good and better. It's the better way to live that he's talking about. But that just seems confusing. How could the day of death be better than the day of birth? And he keeps saying things like this. It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. Why would we rather mourn than feast? He says, for this is the end of all mankind. And he says, sorrow is better than laughter, and sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, and fools are in the house of mirth. What does that mean? It seems like Solomon just wants us to be sad and mopey. Well, what we've seen throughout this book is that the things of this world don't fulfill. Just like that, the wealth that's represented by the precious ointment, the pleasures that come with the things of this world, the laughter, the feasting, the mirth, the partying. He's already talked about it, that those pleasures won't last. They won't fulfill. But why is it better the day of death than the day of birth? Why, basically, is he saying it's better to go to a funeral than be at the hospital when a baby's born? And I think the idea is that when you're at a funeral, it makes you think about important things. It makes you remember that this life is short, it's temporary, that the things of this world don't last. It makes you think about eternal things. The day of death, you're thinking about your end as well. And so it makes you ponder eternal things, and hopefully that will lead you to make your days count. But the day of birth, you're thinking about beginnings and this long life ahead. The day of feasting, you're enjoying the comforts and pleasure, the laughter instead of sadness. You're sitting in your comfort. You're enjoying the good things of this world, and it may lead you to forget that this life is short. But in the mourning, in the sadness, while we don't want to experience those a lot, they can be good tools to point us to the ultimate. That this world is not for us, that it will be remade. That God is coming back to make all things new for those who are His. But if we just rest in our comfort now, we're going to miss the eternal pleasures that come as part of God's family, at God's feast table for eternity. So that's why the day of death is better than the day of birth, because hopefully it will lead us to seek out God who has defeated death. Trust in Him who is in control of all things. Seek Him and follow Him. Then he moves on in verses 5 and 6. He says, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This is also vanity." Proverbs says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." We need to be humble enough. This is the better way, that when we are wrong, that we have people around us who can call us out in love and correct us and lead us back to the straight path of following God. Better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise. We need to hear this a lot because we don't like to be corrected, do we? We always like to think that we're right. We get offended when someone tells us that we're wrong. We keep people around us who will just say, "Yes, oh yeah, you're great, you're right." But Solomon says that that is foolishness. It's the crackling of thorns under a pot. It's just noise. It's not going to last, but better is the rebuke of the wise. We need to be able to be humble, to be corrected, to be rebuked, to be challenged in love. And we need to accept it humbly because it's better for us, because people are there looking out for us to lead us back to this better way. Trusting God, that follows God, that seeks God, instead of just seeking out the song of fools, this carefree, pleasure-filled life that is going to end one day, and it will not fulfill. He moves on in verses 7 through 9. He says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." And what he's talking about here in this section, it is better to be patient than to be quick or hasty and sin. He says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart." If it's in your power, you can get things done easier and quicker by going the corrupt way, by just giving a little bribe, but it will lead you down a bad path. It's not the better way. It's a dishonest way. And oppression drives the wise into madness. It's not the right way. The right way, the better way, to wait for the result that you're working towards. As he says in verse 8, "Better is the end of a thing than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit." This reminds me of a building groundbreaking. Everyone is so excited. We've got a new stadium, a new building project, something that's going to be awesome. And it all starts with that first ceremonial digging up of the dirt with a shovel. Some important person in the project gets to dig into the ground for the first time, and everyone celebrates. But the work isn't done there, is it? It takes a lot of patience and perseverance and hard work to get to the point where that building is usable. It's useful. And so, the dedication ceremony, the grand opening, is better than the groundbreaking. But that takes patience and perseverance. So the better way is waiting patiently, working hard to get to the end of a process, and not just resting as it has begun. And then he says, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." It's really easy. I've heard it said that we live in the age of outrage. It's really easy for us to become quick to be angry. We hear something we don't like. We see something we don't like. Someone does something to us or to someone else that we don't like, and we can become quick to be angry. The Bible tells us to bear with one another in love. We can rebuke in love, correct in love, but when we just become quick to be angry in our heart, what does it say? It says, anger lodges in the heart of fools. So we need to practice patience as we bear with one another, as we correct people in love. Because if, as Ephesians says, if we let the sun go down on our anger, then it's going to give the devil a foothold, and he's going to try and tear down what God is building up. This is specific for the church. We need to take care of our anger. Yes. We don't let it lodge in our hearts. We deal patiently with those who have offended us. There may be a true offense, and that is all fine, but we should not be quick to be angry, but bear with one another in love and patience, pointing each other back to Jesus, just like that rebuke of the wise. So this is all the better way. We seek eternal things. We accept wise counsel and rebuke. We wait patiently and work hard with perseverance. We are patient with those who make us angry. And then we seek out wisdom. Look at verses 10 through 13. He says in verse 10, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. And consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked." So he first out saying, don't look back to the good old days and say, why isn't today like the good old days? We hear that a lot about the good old days. But in general, the good old days weren't just as good. We're just remembering the good about them. The good old days are never as good as we thought they were. And a lot of times in Christian culture, we think of the good old days when it was easier in our society to be a Christian. But that's not the call of the Christian life. Comfort, ease. Jesus tells us to count the cost, to take up our cross and die to ourselves. So we don't need the good old days when we're following the better way. Wisdom says we don't look back, but we live now, following, trusting God and his goodness and his control. But he does. This is Solomon. He's the wisest man. So he gives us the value of wisdom in verse 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and an advantage to those who see the sun. Wisdom will help us protect what we have. And he says, for the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. The advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. So wisdom has a benefit. While it won't be ultimate, while we don't know all things, wisdom has benefit, just like money has benefit. It won't last, it won't fulfill, but there is benefit to having some money, just like there is benefit in life to having some wisdom. So he's saying, seek out wisdom. Use it well. Use what you have well. But then, just to make sure that we know that it won't last, that it won't be ultimate, he says in verse 13, consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. He said this, or something like this, in chapter 1, verse 15. And the whole idea is that there has been things that God has done, God will do, that we don't understand. We don't get it, and we can't change it to make it how we want it to. Job tried, and he got humbled. We can't fight with one that is stronger than us, as Solomon said in chapter 6. We can't change what God has done. But we can trust that he's in control and that he's good. We might not understand it. We might not see it. But this better way, as we consider God's works, even if we don't understand it, is that we trust him. that we see that He's good, and that we follow Him. And we follow Him in any circumstance. We're going to move on, and we're going to see in verses 14 through 24 that we can trust God. We can follow this better way. Even when we don't understand, we can do it in the good and the bad. So look at chapter 7, verse 14 with me. He says, "In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him." So he says something that's difficult for us right now. He says, God has made the day of prosperity as well as the day of adversity. God doesn't do evil, but God is in control of all things. He's saying, when we get the good, be joyful. But remember that God is in control of everything, even on your worst day. We don't know what's coming next. We don't know if we're going to have a season of adversity, a season of prosperity, or a mix of the two. It says, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. We don't know. God knows. Can you trust that He is good? Like we talked about last week, that He is the God who sees us, that He is the God who cares for us, that He is the God who looks after us, that acts for us. And as Romans says, that He is, for those who love Him, He is working all things out for our good, even if it's in times of adversity right now. Can you trust that? In the good, be joyful, be thankful. In the day of adversity, can you trust God? Run to Him as your refuge, knowing that He is the God who sees and cares, and He's in control of it all. Because life doesn't work out how we think it should. We think it should be like A plus B equals C. And we see it even in Proverbs, these wise sayings. Be righteous and good will happen, but Ecclesiastes sees a little bit more of the real world instead of that formula. And so he says in verse 15, "In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing." Righteous experience bad, wicked prosper. It's not how we think it should be. Things that we don't like happen. We are hurt. We are sad. We feel pain. We see the brokenness of this world. It doesn't work out as a formula. We can't do something to get good and do another thing to avoid the bad. The good and the bad are going to come. Can we trust that God is in control of it all? Seek Him, follow Him, run to Him when we're hurting. And Solomon says something strange here in verses 16 and 17. Something that doesn't make sense right away. He says, "Don't be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time?" So it sounds like he's saying, don't be too good and don't be too bad. Maybe you can just kind of be in the middle of the road. But the idea here isn't that your good acts are going to get you something. As we see the righteous and the wicked get both good and bad. But what he's saying here in verse 16, he says, "Be not overly righteous and do not make yourself too wise." He's saying, don't be self-righteous. Don't think that your righteousness comes from your acts, from your goodness. Don't think that you are the smartest person in the room. Don't make yourself out to be the important one. It's pride. And it leads, what does it say? To destruction. Why should you destroy yourself? we know the better way, in the good and the bad, is that our righteousness doesn't come from us. The Bible says that no one is righteous. No one, no, not one. No one seeks after God. Our righteousness is given to us through faith in Jesus. Jesus is the only man who ever lived who was perfectly sinless, who never did anything wrong or disobedient. And when we trust in Him, in His death for the forgiveness of our sins, and His resurrection for the new life that we will receive, that we are given His righteousness as if His goodness was ours, and that's how God sees us. Your righteousness is not in and of yourself, so don't be proud. But don't also be so proud to say that, oh, I can do whatever I want and nothing's going to happen to me. Because he says in verse 17, do not be overly wicked, neither be a fool. For why should you die before your time? Self-righteousness, pride will lead us to destruction. But wickedness, sin, this life away from God, turned away from God, disobeying what He's done, is foolish, and it will lead to your untimely death, is what it says. Why should you die before your time? Wickedness, self-righteousness, they're both ways to go that are apart from God. One says, I don't need God because I'm so good. The other says, I don't trust God, I don't care, I'm going to do what I want. And they both end in destruction. So what is the response? We've already seen God is in control. He has a better way for us. So what do we do? Solomon answers us in verse 18. He says, it is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. In the day of prosperity and in the day of adversity, those who fear God, those who follow God, those who obey God, those who submit their lives to God, trusting in Jesus, His Son, and being welcomed into His family, those who fear and honor the one true Creator, God, will be cared for, will come out of the day of prosperity and the day of adversity. They will be able to handle the good and the bad because they fear God and they know that He is good and that He is in control of all things and that He has promised are good in everything and that He's promised to make all things new one day. That this is not the end. That suffering doesn't have the final word. That sin doesn't have the final word. That wealth and prosperity don't have the final word. That God has the final word and He will make all things new and we will dwell with Him forever. For those who love Him, for those who fear Him, for those who follow His better way, which is through Jesus. You see, it's wisdom. Solomon says in Proverbs, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And what does he say in verse 19 here? He says, wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in the city. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and wisdom gives you strength. Strength to persevere in the good and the bad. Strength to walk this life, knowing that things are broken because of sin, that there will be hurt and pain and sadness, but knowing that there is something better. It gives you strength for patience and perseverance when someone hurts you, when someone makes you angry. It gives you strength to seek the eternal in the day of death and look beyond the fleeting pleasures of this world to seek the God who is in control. Wisdom gives you more strength to the wise man than 10 rulers who are in a city. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So we seek God, we trust God, we learn about God, we know God. But you know what? We're not all going to do this perfectly. Like I said, no one is righteous. Now we have Jesus' righteousness given to us. It's in our record. It's in our account. But we still sin. We still fail. And so we need to remember God is in control. Our righteousness comes from Jesus. We need to not get too proud. Because he says in verse 20, surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. There isn't. There was one. He's Jesus, and we are not him. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. It's that call to humble patience with other believers, with people that don't follow Jesus, because we know that we have been redeemed, that without Jesus we have no righteousness, we have no hope. We are not welcome in God's family except through Jesus. It is this better way. There's no one that is completely righteous that doesn't sin. So when you hear people talking bad against you, you can be patient. You can not be angry in your heart, because you know that in your heart you have spoken bad about somebody else. They just didn't hear it. That you have thought evil things about other people. You just heard what other people said against you. And you can be patient and you can be humble, knowing that there is no one that is without sin, and that it is only through Jesus that we are made right with God. And if we think we know, look at what Solomon concludes with. He says, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? So Solomon, he starts this section with God's control in chapter 6. God has named all things. He knows all things. He knows what's good for us. He knows what will be after us. He has a better way for us, even when we don't understand everything. And that better way comes through fearing God, through seeking Him, through trusting Him, trusting that He is good and that He loves us, even when we cannot figure out all things. We can humble ourselves before God, knowing that He is in control, knowing that He is good, that He sees us, that He cares for us. We can trust in Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through Him. And we can follow that better way, being renewed, being redeemed, seeking eternal things, being humble enough to be called out when we do wrong, being patient, seeking wisdom. We can humble ourselves. We can fear the one true God who is in control. We can let go of our sense of control so we don't have to live anxious lives trying to figure out what's the best way. We can humble ourselves, submit ourselves to God, and follow His better way. We can trust in Him in the good and the bad. We can have hope that this world is not ultimate, but that God is bringing better things. He is bringing good for all those who love Him, for all those who follow Him. Would you trust in God today? In whatever circumstance you're in, would you trust in Him? Trust in Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins and new life so that you can follow this better way. That you can put your hope in God in an anxious time, in a painful time, and in the good times. Follow God's better way. Trust in His control. Fear Him, seek Him, and hope in Him, because He's good. He's working these things for are good for those who love him, for those who follow him. Pray with me. God, in our life, we want to feel like we have control. But ultimately, it is an illusion. Thank you that you are in control of it all. Help us to open our hands, surrender our fears and our anxieties to you, whether we're in the midst of prosperity or in the midst of adversity. God, let us trust that you are good, that you are in control, and that you care for us. Help us to seek Jesus, trust in him, and walk this better way that you have for us. It's a better way of life. It's a hopeful way of life, and it's lasting. Let us walk in that. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us this week online. Again, we would love to have you join us in person. We meet Sunday afternoons, 4:30 p.m. at 136 Louisiana Boulevard. We'd love for you to join us to worship with us. Things are opening up in our state. People are getting vaccinated. We'd love for you to join us, to worship with us in person. If you're new or if you've been watching for a while and haven't connected with us, please do connect with us through our website, through our Facebook page. Leave a comment. Connect with us. We would love for you to join us. We have a text line you can text. Love for you to connect with us. Now let us close today by worshiping this God who has a better way for us, who is good and has good for us. Let's worship him now.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire in darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, sing of the goodness of God. been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.